All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Cool. So I'm talking about education mostly because it's like one of the most common debating topics because like most people go through education. It's something that really affects everything. And therefore, like if you actually do a debate competition, it's likely to be one of the most common things that come up. There's probably at least one education motion every single competition. And I think like it's just very useful to go through. So yeah, cool. Firstly, like when we talk about education, like we really have to understand what is the purpose of education, right? Most people think that education is to like make skills, to like make you more employable in the real world because you've learned stuff, right? But then you can also say that that's really not the case because what you're doing in education is more like just like memorizing things for tests, right? Like I'm sure all of you have like had those days where you didn't really revise and therefore you've had to cram like the last hour before an exam, and it's more like succeeding in the system where you have loads of exams and you're just like cramming to get the top mark, but you're not actually really learning things, right? So it's quite like a double-edged sword where people can say that education is actually really good, where you can say that you're actually learning so much stuff that's so useful for life, but on the same side you can also say that really what you're doing is just like studying, learning how to memorize things, right? Which is becoming increasingly like useless when like the internet is so available for everyone. You can already like look up stuff such as like, I don't know, what is the formula for sodium chloride, right? I don't need to learn these things anymore when I can just look it up on the internet. So then we can frame education in a different way, which is like preparing for the real world, right? Stuff that you do in your childhood is usually stuff that is like preparing you for the real world. For example, like as a kid, I get toys, like train sets and stuff, right? And like I know like loads of my friends who are girls also got like cooking sets or tea sets, and it's kind of like it's like enforcing stereotypes as a child, like these are the things that you're going to do in the real world, right? And therefore in education it also comes into play where you talk about like you get like student councils where you're trying to like interact with people who are not normally in your comfort zone. You're learning like leadership roles and stuff like open days where you're going out and showing people your school. You're interacting with people who are not in your life, right? You're preparing yourself for the real world, which is something that people can say is what education is for. But fourthly, like people can also talk about how education is about becoming good people, right? Like you have punishments in school for like even like victimless crimes like cheating in tests, right? Which is especially like when you think about it, like if you cheat in a primary school test, that's not really something that's like really going to go down in your record, right? But they still punish you for it, right? Because it's schools are here to teach you that like you have to understand like your consequences to an action, right? You're doing something wrong and you have to understand that there are consequences even if it's like not very important, because that makes you more moral in the real world. But then at the same time, this can be used as an argument if you say like the schools are actually imperfect actors, they don't really teach very good morals. But like given that there are so many like purposes of education, you can now like talk about like in debates where it's like about standardized testing, for example, you can actually talk about different purposes and weigh them up against each other, right? So I think there's quite a couple of classic clashes in education, right? Firstly, is about like the main purpose of debate of education, right? Which is like skills and succeeding in the system, right? So the most common like type of motion for this is this house believes standardized testing does more than harm than good, right? So I'm going to try and make this kind of interactive. So if anyone listening can tell me like what would a government side of this motion try to be promoting, skills or succeeding in the system? Um, you can just unmute if you want or type it into chat. I mean, I'm sure you're like all dead from doing an exam, but I'm presuming you still want to listen because you turned up. So okay. Um, well, Raja, strong
Z
thing.
okay, I'll do this one. But Zion, for future ones, I think you can call on them even if they don't like raise their hands or volunteer, and that would be fine as
Okay,
well.
cool.
For this one, I'd say that the proposition is trying to say that standardized testing supports succeeding in the system, and that's not good because we should be supporting learning real skills.
Okay, that's correct. Yeah, because like now once you get that as like the motion and you understand that your standardized testing does support succeeding in the system, the way you win this debate is by talking about weighing. So why is skills actually more important than succeeding in the system? Does anyone have an answer for that? Like, Brian?
Because like skills are going to help you in life, like when you grow.
Yeah, sure. Like skills are the things that actually like employers actually look for, right? Like for example, if I'm actually really good at sitting tests, but like I don't actually know how to actually like interact with people, that's going to be pretty useless for me in the real world, right? So I think that's what government can likely say. But like, what can opposition say? Ruhan, any ideas? Why is succeeding in the system more important than skills?
I guess it could I'm not really sure actually.
Okay, no worries. So I think the main argument that opposition can run for why succeeding in the system is particularly important is because imagine you don't have standardized testing, right? You have a world where like nobody sits the SATs, for example, and the universities no longer have this thing to compare you against other people, right? Now you get like universities having to pick people a lot more like based on like teachers' opinions of you on these personal statements. And it's a lot less like based on a thing that everyone does, and it's a lot harder to choose who's actually a good student. And you can say that like people who are actually working really hard get screwed over because they no longer are compared with other people equally, and that's why like standardized testing is actually good, right? So I think skills versus succeeding in the system is one of the most common clashes in this education types of motions. But also there's like clashes on protecting the child in like the short term versus like maximizing their growth in the long term. One of the most common motions for this is like creating LGBTQ plus only schools, right? So why would people actually create LGBTQ only schools? Ishani, do you know?
Maybe because I guess there's a lot of bullying in school. So if we created LGBTQ like only schools, like there wouldn't be any like homophobic attacks or whatever in school against them.
Exactly. Can I just stick with you for a bit? Say opposition comes in and talks about how if you shelter them from these homophobic attacks, when they go into the real world, there's still homophobia, they still get bullied. Why is it more important to protect them now than say it is to like than in their adulthood, right? Like, why is it more important that you protect the child rather than like protecting them as they go into adulthood?
I mean, now it's most important because they shouldn't have to worry about that, because I guess they should be focused on like learning and their education and other things rather than like focusing on like, oh, there's so much like queer phobia and stuff. So
yeah, it's kind of this argument where you say it's unjust to impose suffering on a kid just to make them have better future prospects, right? You can say that their future prospects are uncertain, right? Even if you have them bullied, they could get like irreversible trauma and all of this, right? It's like saying you should make a child walk on coals because it makes them more resilient to heat. Like, it's kind of ridiculous. But like opposition, government, I could talk about irreversible trauma, all of this. But when I go to opposition, I can say like, it's just your lives are slightly harder. Notice like I'm changing the language here. And like, why do you think that opposition can argue that like it's better if they're protected in the future because they already know how homophobia feels like than if they're like sheltered away in the past? Taryn, any ideas? Okay, I'm guessing you're either muted or you're not here. So, Pinaki, any ideas?
Okay, sorry, can you repeat your question?
Pardon? I didn't catch that, sorry.
Can you repeat your question? Your voice is cracking for me.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So why is it more important? Why can opposition claim that it's more important for you to actually know how homophobia feels like as an LGBTQ student, so that when you go into the future, you're more prepared for homophobia?
It might be because in later on you will see the real world, and once you see the real world, you might have a lot of pressure all of a sudden. But if you are slowly from a child, like slowly getting to feel and understand how the real world is, then it won't be too much at once.
Yeah, I think that's mostly analysis as to what will happen though. But why is this too much at once particularly bad for when you're an adult compared to when you're a child?
Because firstly, when you're an adult, you will have different other things like job, college, and such. And if you get overwhelmed with the being in the LGBTQ group, then you will get really overwhelmed, and that will lead to many things like depression and so much more.
Yeah, that's along the right lines. I think saying that adults have a lot more things to care about is pretty much accurate. You can talk about how children do have like safety nets, do have support networks of their parents being able to like look after them if they get bullied. Whereas once you're an adult, you don't have any of this. You no longer can turn to your parents because you're actually like an individual now. You have your individuality, and it's a lot harder for you to get this support. And you can also talk about how, as an adult, you have more impactful decisions relating to your job, whereas as a kid, your decisions aren't as important. And you can talk about how depression therefore affects you more as an adult. So once again, these clashes can be argued on both sides of the house, right? You can talk about how you can protect the child in the short term. You can talk about how you can make them more used to homophobia in the long term. But the most important thing is weighing, right? As my like godly partner Sean's already told you about, like weighing is like extremely important in these debates, and yeah, that's how you win most debates. Cool. Okay, now onto like what's more in like education, like what are the problems with education, right? So firstly, like internal issues, I think is pretty obvious insofar as like not all schools are like private funded, like extremely rich schools. There are a lot of schools which have lacks of resources, and there's like overcrowding, and this is like makes like education a lot worse when you have like one teacher to like 10 students versus like in a overcrowded school, one teacher to 40 students. I think that's pretty intuitive. But more on that is that there are like external issues, which is to say like there's a huge pressure on these low income background students, right? So like what I mean by this is like, for example, if I have a sibling to take care of, which I don't, like, or like I have housework because my parents are working like every single day, or like even I have a part-time job because I need to support my family, I'm a lot more wanting to get back home from school than actually focusing on school, right? We tell you that therefore like you as a low income background students, it's a lot more hard for you to like actually access education in the first place when you're worried about all of these other things. But secondly, like there's a failure for these schools to connect to these low income background students in the first place, right? So like what I mean by this is like, for example, in the UK, A levels help wealthier people, and it's ignoring a lot of like migrant kids who should be taking like English second language classes, right? Or like remedial classes for like those with lower income backgrounds, right? It's less relevant to like low income people, even though it's like a standardized test that goes throughout the world. And therefore it's like quite inaccessible. When like I literally don't understand English when I first moved to England, then I don't think that sitting GCSEs or A levels is very useful for me. So like there's quite a lot of like issues with education system right now, right? But more so, let's talk about like post-colonial states, for example, I think is like quite a good example of where these issues really come to play, right? For example, like let's take an example. I think South Africa, I think they have a very trivial curriculum versus like the rigorous like East Asian ones. Like I know like from friends that they tell me that like in South African exams, there's been like ones where like it's like telling the time, right? Like it's 8 p.m. now, 6 hours later, what time is it, right? It's literally simple addition, right? And like it's not very like good curriculum. It doesn't make you like a lot more clever at like this like packed stuff that's actually like you're actually sitting, right? Like these curriculums are just not very good, and we tell you that like it's just quite like unuseful for like post-colonial states to actually have this. But why do these states actually have these like terrible curriculums, right? Firstly, like historically, right, where like for example in South Africa where there was apartheid, right, where white children were separated from those of color, from Indians and from like black children, that's people had an active incentive to keep the white people in power, and therefore they undermined the education of those in color. So like there's no highbrow like education for these people in the past. They don't have like history or geography or advanced maths. They probably only had like simple like mathematics or like simple English, right? So like in the past, teachers aren't like very trained for like this good curriculum that is now coming. It's a lot easier for teachers to adapt to like a trivial curriculum. So like you get like teachers teaching like a lot worse stuff because you don't have very well trained teachers. But secondly, like in South Africa now, because like of this lack of education in the past, people now have to like decrease the pass rates to allow more people to pass. So what you're seeing is like pass rates could have been like 70, but now they have to decrease it to like 60 to 50 to allow more people to pass. And in effect, this is actually worse for like these schools as a whole because people don't feel like they have to learn as much because they don't have to learn as much and they can still pass. So we say it's like in these post-colonial states, there's a lot of like negative history that's affecting education as a whole, and therefore there's still issues there, right? But thirdly, like who has a say in these schools, right? So we can say like there's like rich white middle class parents are the ones who are actually catered to the most, and mostly this is because like these are the ones who are likely to actually like give donations. For example, like at Eton College where I go to, like there's loads of parents who like can just like give donations to like fund the school and like their child can just get in, right? Like we there's like this is why like these schools actually cater to these like rich white middle class parents, right? Because they want, and also because like these children are likely to already be like pressured by their parents because their parents want them to be successful, and like they want to get a high attainment record, right? Like schools want to publicize themselves as like one of the best schools getting the most like results, so they also want to cater to people who already like are likely to have a high standard of like education. And this is like inherently bad because then you're no longer catering to those who are most at need, if you understand what I'm talking about. Cool. But like now onto like how parents interact with like the educational system, right? So like, for example, there's a motion about like this house would make additional benefits conditional on children's academic performance, right? And like, therefore parents have an incentive to keep children in school, right? Because they want these benefits, right? Like there's a lot of things that parents actually can do to make their children actually work at school, right? For example, like there are motions about like teaching progressive material in schools, such as like make sex ed in conservative areas mandatory, right? Like we can tell you that like there's, if you're like in a conservative area, right, parents are likely to be conservative and they're able to like provide counter arguments at home, right? So like they're able to have like backlash. These parents are actually able to do like negative things, right? We tell you that like these, why are these parents especially important? Brian, can you tell me like a couple of reasons why these parents are actually able to like control their kids' education?
Well, the parents, they're like they like worry about their kids, and they like they basically get to decide what their kids do like before they're like 18.
Yeah.
I don't.
I mean, like, of course, parents have like a certain amount of control over what you're allowed to do. Sure, they're able to no longer send you to extracurricular activities, for example, or they don't help you do schoolwork because they don't want you to actually learn about sex ed, right? But like even more so, I think it's like what the parents' attitudes to studying, like it shapes how children are like having their own attitudes, right? Like children want to impress their parents to get validation because their parents are the people who are closest to them. And therefore, if your parent tells you that like this school is teaching you wrong stuff, you're less likely to listen to everything else that the school actually tells you, right? But also like parents are the ones who work closest with the school in a way, which is to say like parents actually are the ones who enforce you going to school, who enforce you to go like do homework, right? Like schools can give you detention, sure. But like the biggest threat is like always, I'm going to tell your parents, right? Because like you're scared what your parents will actually do, right? It's like parents are the ones who can actually ground you, right? And so the school having the parents' trust is crucial for making progress with kids, right? But once you get like parents like not actually agreeing with what the school is teaching, that's when you get a lot worse education as a whole, because these parents no longer care about their children going to this school. They might want to transfer schools, or they just might like not like help as much enforcing in like going to school, right? But like also let's talk about like religion, which is one of the things that parents interact with as well, right? So like this house believes that laïcité has done more harm than good. Laïcité is like a French word, I think. It's basically the separation of religion and life, right? Including like banning religious schools, right? So what is Gov likely to say? Can I get an argument from Athav?
I'm not really sure. Could you repeat that again? I'm still thinking.
Okay, cool. So basically, the motion is like basically banning religious schools, let's say, right? And
Yeah.
that banning religious schools has done more harm than good. Why is banning religious schools bad?
Because maybe some parents want their kids to learn a religion outside of home, and then they can implement it inside home with some more additions that they can teach, and it would just be against them. Maybe uh I know there's cases of people shunning others for not following their religion, so that could be also a main factor as well.
Yeah, sure. There is like shunning others for not following your religion. But let's think about like where these religious schools are likely to be, right? I think the most likely case is it's like in like these developed countries because that's where like you actually get like the most migrants coming in. Whereas if it's in like the place where like these people actually already all like agree to this religion, then these people already like teach this religion in school anyway. It's not likely to be specifically a religious school, right? So I think, sure, there is like shunning those who don't respect your religion, but when it becomes a minority, when like you're coming from a religious background into a Western country and you're studying in this new country, I think it's a lot more difficult to actually force people to go into non-religious schools, right? You don't understand atheism if like God is your most important thing like throughout your whole life, right? And like there's this sense of like connection and identity which is more important than integrating yourself into like a school with other people, right? Like for example in Europe, secularism is like especially like important in like alienating for like extremists, right? Like children of migrants who went for a better life, so they try to connect with people who think they understand them, but then like these children are going to like go to these non-religious schools, they don't actually feel as much connection, and that's when like terrorist organizations with ulterior motives can actually target these children by trying to convince them that like, oh, these people are wrong, we're actually the right ones, that you're getting bullied for bad reasons. And like it's a lot more difficult to like tell you that like you actually want to go to these schools when your most important thing in your life so far has been like this religion, right? So government can say that. Now what can opposition say in counter to that? Ishani?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? You cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry, I think I have some Wi-Fi issue then, I guess. So like when like governments say like it's difficult to integrate into these schools, what can opposition say? Like even if we ignore integration, right? What else is bad about like religious schools?
I mean,
Think about like what I've just told you about like how it's likely to be like not very many people going to these schools in the first place because it's likely to be migrants.
so I guess it'll just like create if like a little group or like small population of people who go to these religious schools and learn a different way. So like instead of like the separation of like church and or other like religion and education, they now have it a more focused part of their life. It's like because you could have it because I guess normal kids a lot of them would just have it like with their family at home, but now they also have it in school, so it's become more of a focus in their life.
Yeah, for sure. You can also like talk about like since it's so few kids, like it's likely to be underfunded when like the majority of kids go to like a different school. You're probably more likely to focus your funds on those schools. And regards to integration, you can go back to like what I talked about earlier, which is like protecting your child in the short term or like maximizing their growth in the long term. Once again, weighing, but you've already heard that from my partner. So cool. Next on to like inequality. yeah, I think we have to like remember that there's quite a lot of inequality in schools, and that not everyone goes to like a private school likely to go to university, right? I think there's quite a lot of alternatives there. And I think that like there's quite a lot of impact on like parents' education backgrounds on like how the children actually work, right? For example, in my early childhood, say I have like a stay-at-home parent because my parents, one of them is like able to earn enough money, then I'm better at socializing because I'm interacting more with other people. Maybe I learn to read or write first, and this parent is able to give me so much more support, right? And like on the comparative, you get like children who are like left to their own devices, they may like suffer more in their like early childhood, right? But also like they can give like academic support, and they can give extracurricular support, such as like going like paying for your tutoring or sports, but also like work experience, which is something that's very prevalent, especially through like nepotism, where you can like ask your parents to introduce you to like someone that you know, right? But we can talk about like this house would implement quotas for racial minorities at school, or like this house would make children from private schools get higher baseline grades to get into university, right? Both of these motions have the same clash, right? So like, what is this clash? Ruhan, can you tell me what kind of clash this is? Okay, never mind. Basically, like, essentially, if I implement quotas for racial minorities, right, I get more racial minorities getting into my school, but at the same time, these racial minorities are likely to face backlash, right? For example, like the Harvard acceptance scandal, right, a couple of years back, when like there was like reports saying like they discriminated against like Asians because of certain reasons. Like a lot of people in the Asian community get angry, right? A lot of Chinese parents I know are like, why are they doing this? You have to like actually like consider like the amount of backlash that you can actually get from like introducing quotas, right? But on the same time, like the government can say that you will always get backlash from majority. Like, so does that mean that we don't want more progressivism? Like, sure, we get backlash, but you always get backlash. We still need to implement this progressivism, right? We can talk about like how backlash makes you feel unwelcome, and there's always like this clash where you have to weigh it out, right? I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just speed through these last couple of lines. Okay, social rules of schools. Obviously, socialization is something that's quite important. For example, in like a motion like this house would abolish like single-sex schools, right? You can talk about how like in single-sex schools you don't know how to talk to girls, you're more likely to grow up not being able to talk to girls, etc. I mean, yeah, like socialization, it's important for you to find out how to like make friends, right? As a kid, right? It's like where you actually talk to other people, because like likely at home you don't actually have that many people to talk to. But also like it's like a childcare service for low income neighborhoods, right? So for example, what I mean by this is like Michelle Obama like made like free school lunches project, which is what like her legacy is basically now, right? Where like you get like you're going there not only for like educational attainment, but also because like you can actually get food there, your nutrition is ensured, and that gives a far more incentive to like actually participate at these schools, because at least you get like free lunch, at least you get like warm heated buildings, which you might not have at home, right? But thirdly, like on like education and like governments, right? So like what I mean by this is like firstly, like investment in education doesn't mean like education is standard as good. For example, like the US, right? It could be extremely unequal, like I've told you about, right? Where like it's allocated differently, especially to like rich white communities have more like allocation to them, right? For example, right? But like also like talk about like these policies, right? I think interesting case study is like Brazil, where they have Bolsa Familia, where this like socialist guy called like Lula da Silva, some socialist guy, made like loans. If kids go to school, then you can actually take loans out, which ensures like keeping kids in schools, because like these loans help these businesses of these families, and therefore they can make the kid go to school even more. But also these parents, as I've already told you, how they interact with the system, right? They want to get these loans, and therefore they're more willing to like send their children to school. But thirdly, like education as a tool for political control, right? So what I mean by this is like not only in democracies but also in autocracies. Like, where do you think like has the better education, democracies or autocracies? And that's just a general question to everyone. Like, just feel free to unmute and say like democracies or autocracies. Rajas, you can answer that.
Yeah, I think most people say and agree that like democracies are better.
Yeah, I think most people would say that, but the actual fact is that is most likely incorrect, because autocracies actually have a better education, because like, for example, like let's take the US, right? It's a democracy, but like there's loads of inequality in there, and sure, you get like good education for some people, but a lot of people actually suffer, right? So why are autocracies actually better, right? Because like democracies, you get like 4 years in power, you're not like willing to pour money into education because you don't see it coming into like your time in term, right? You're helping, like it takes decades for a child to fully pass through the education system, and like you're actually helping the next party, because that's when like these benefits are realized, right? So you don't have an incentive because you have this short-term re-election incentive, right? But like this looks like voters voting on like single issues such as like Trump winning on slogans like take back American jobs, right? People don't see the benefits of education, right? But autocracies, it could be like benign, but even if they're like bad, they have the capacity to actually make education good, right? They have absolute control and they can get change done quickly, right? They can do well to gain legitimacy, but we can also talk about like it's invested in to prevent rebellions. So that like it's like you can like trickle down like ideas about how your country is actually good, and people actually invest in education, right? And therefore you get like these people investing into education to prevent rebellion, to create satisfaction, and it's like a tool for political control, right? If I write a curriculum myself, then I can make kids growing up admiring me. And I think that's what's particularly important in autocracies, where they actually invest in education because they have like the incentive to do so. Whereas in democracies, they don't really have the incentive to do so because they're really just benefiting their future parties, right? So the most important thing from this lecture is remember weighing, right? There's like a billion clashes you can have. There's skills versus success. There's the fundamental clashes of like protecting your child in the short term versus like helping them in the long term. And there's like great arguments for both sides, right? And the most important thing is just to show why one is more important. And I hope like you guys can take that away and use it in your debates right now. Cool. Cheers. Hopefully on time.